So here at the Ohio History Connection, we have nearly 500 quilts that range in date from the mid-18th century all the way up to the present. So let's take a look at a sampling of some of those quilts. This one is a wool whole cloth quilt made between 1775 and 1825 in or around Marietta in southeastern Ohio. It's called a whole cloth quilt. It's actually made from several different pieces of fabric stitched together. This is a really unique quilt though. This one, you'll see the quilting doesn't actually line up, and that's because these pieces were each quilted before the quilt was assembled. And that's because this quilt is made from an old petticoat. It wore out its function and someone disassembled it and stitched it back together to form a quilt. It really speaks to the frugality that a lot of early Ohioans had to employ to take care of their families at a time when access to goods was really difficult. By the mid-1900s, quilts started to look more like this one. It's a red and green applique quilt made in about 1860 by Julia Hayden Marshall and Frances Marshall McClurg, who was her daughter. They were a mother and daughter team. Now, an applique quilt is different from a whole cloth quilt because these colored pieces were cut out of fabric and then stitched to this white background. To create their colored applique shapes, women would have used a pattern. This particular pattern is made from a tin sheet metal. They would have traced this onto the colored fabric and cut out the pieces to ensure that their pattern would be uniform and even. By the late 19th century, quilts really changed in the way they looked. This is a pieced crazy quilt made by Anna Simpson when she was just 24 years old, and she made it in 1887 in Ross County, Ohio. Crazy quilts are actually patternless quilts. A quilter could piece together whatever fabric she wanted in whatever order she wanted them. Crazy quilts also tend to be really dark in color because they were made during what we call the Victorian era, which is that last quarter of the 19th century. At the time, Americans were enamored with Queen Victoria of England. She had lost her husband in 1861 and wore black for the rest of her life to mourn his death. That was another 40 years. So in the United States, we emulated Queen Victoria by wearing dark clothing and having dark colors as part of our home decor. By the 20th century, quilt colors become lighter and brighter, and we start to see more designs focused on children, like this one that features children dancing around a maypole surrounded by flowers and birds. This crib-sized applique quilt was made for two sisters, Mary and Margaret Cross, in Ashland County, Ohio, between 1915 and 1925. At this point in time, scientists were learning that children benefited from a carefree period in their young lives. Previously, it was thought that children would just be treated like little adults. But by the 19-teens, there were child labor laws, there was an emphasis on children going to school, and much more of an emphasis on childhood than there ever had been in the past. And we start to see this idea infiltrating quilt design. Quilting has regained its popularity in the last part of the 20th century. More women are creating quilts like this one that are art quilts. This quilt was made by Dayton, Ohio native Mary Catherine Borkowski in 1982. She created the design herself. She calls it Tornado Winds, and she based it off of the devastating tornadoes that hit Xenia, Ohio in 1974. In the 20th century, all the way up to today, we have more and more people who are quilting. They're making quilts like this that end up in museums. They're also making more traditional bed quilts and doing twists on traditional patterns or even completely new designs.